This is Grant Miller doing a presentation for CAS 451 on ARM processors in mobile devices. In this presentation, I will be covering a few things. To start off with, I'll be covering the market share in quotations of ARM processors. I put that in quotations because it'll be less about the business-y side of what market share means, and it'll be more about defining a few terms, discussing how prevalent ARM processors are in mobile devices currently, what the architectures look like, and how they're distributed and manufactured. Secondly, we'll talk about a few specifics of ARM processors. We'll talk about more general aspects of an ARM or ARM-based processor, and then we'll get down to the more detailed aspects of them and the history of how they've evolved a little bit. And then we'll talk about how ARM processors are preferable to other options, if they are. We'll talk about how they perform compared to recent alternatives. And then finally, we'll talk about a few changes to architectures on mobile platforms in regards to mobile ARM processors. Starting with the ARM processor market share, it's estimated in 2013 it was estimated that nearly 60% of all mobile devices use at least one ARM or ARM-based processor, and in 2010 I believe it was estimated that nearly 90% of all smartphones use at least one ARM or ARM-based processor. And I'll get to why that is in a few moments. But first I'd like to define what it means to be an ARM processor and an ARM-based processor. ARM Holdings, the company that make the ARM architectures, don't really manufacture their own processors. Their business model instead is that they have two different licenses that they sell to other companies. The first license is for their core designs. So companies can buy this license, and then ARM essentially gives them the designs for a pre-made core. In this case, it's their Cortex cores, and then that company makes it and includes it on their system on a chips or SoCs. And then there's the architectural licenses, and the architectural licenses include two instruction sets, the ARM instruction set and the Thumb 2 instruction set. And it also comes with general guidelines on the architecture, like how many general purpose registers, the width of the registers, that kind of thing. And the company can then use this architecture base to build their own CPU around. And you see later on that a lot of companies have seen great success doing so. And that's what it means to be ARM and ARM-based. ARM meaning you have bought the license for the direct core designs and you just manufacture the Cortex cores yourselves. And being ARM-based, you bought the architectural license and you actually built a CPU around ARM's architecture. There's two ARM architectures. In general, there are a few offshoots, but in general there's ARM v7 and ARM v8. Both are RISC-based architectures with a few decidedly non-RISC aspects, and I'll cover those later. But ARM v7 was a 32-bit architecture, and ARM v8 moved to 64, and you're only seeing ARM v8 within the past couple years in the move to 64-bit processors on mobile devices. But back to the market share, we'll be focusing throughout the presentation on two ARM cores, the Cortex A8 and the A9, and the Qualcomm Crate, which is an ARM-based processor. And we'll be focusing on those because they are a good example of how ARM and ARM-based processors have evolved over time, and how the ARM-based processors are actually getting quite a bit more popular than just buying the core designs themselves. And here you can see that the ARM A8 was one of the first to kind of move into the mobile device market in a big way. It was used in the iPhone 4 and iPad, Samsung Galaxy S, and Google used them for their phones as well, and their tablets. And the A9 saw the same amount of success with Samsung phones. It was in the PlayStation Vita. It continued to be in a couple different Apple products as well. But then Qualcomm Crate processor was made as an ARM-based processor, and it's featured in their Snapdragon system on chips, which is extremely popular in in phones recently. And Apple moved on to an ARM-based rather than using directly using ARM's cores. Moving into the specifics of mobile ARM processors, this will take up the bulk of the presentation. First, I'd like to start with a few of the general aspects of the ARM architecture. They're all RISC-based. In fact, they're almost the spitting image of RISC-based architecture. They're all load-store-based. They all have a lot of general-purpose registers, somewhere between 30 and 31. And they're all very lean, and there's only one or two decidedly non-RISC based aspects to the ARM architectures. The ARM architectures support two instruction sets, ARM and Thumb2, and they do this because in the architecture, in the hardware, they include two decoders, one for each instruction set, and this lets them expand their instruction set a little bit, not as huge as CISC can be and the Intel x86 ones with variable size instructions and the massive amount of instructions that it supports, but it gives them a little more variety without compromising size as well as the aspects of RISC it carries. And it's actually the aspects of RISC that made the ARM Cortex A8 very popular. On the slide, you see that it's a 32-bit processor because it's on the ARM v7 architecture, and it's got in-order execution. It's superscalar dual issue, meaning it has two functional units, so it can process two instructions at the same time. It's got a 13-stage pipeline because it was sort of on the trailing edge before multi-core on mobile devices, so pipelines were still a little big. And it was, like I mentioned, it's single core. So it was lean intentionally because it had to be power efficient. And before multi-core, the way you had to do that, you had to sacrifice quite a bit of functionality to do that if you couldn't add more cores. And you see that in the A9. You see multiple improvements, out of order executions. They added an extra functional unit for superscalar three-way. They added speculative execution. They shortened the pipeline a bit, but now you have multi-core in 2 or 4 cores, and that drastically improved power efficiency, so that let them add, and also due to advancements in processors, they could afford to add those new technologies to it. And then you have the Qualcomm Crate, which isn't too far ahead of the A9, but it's a 32-bit. It's based on the ARM v7 architecture, and it's got out-of-order execution, superscalar 7-way, so that's 7 functional units, and everything else looks exactly the same as the A9. And the reason that is because multi-core reduced the power consumption of processors, but beyond having out-of-order execution and shortening the pipeline, there still wasn't much you could do to improve the performance beyond adding just more functional units to split up the workload. And we'll talk about a few extra advancements within the past couple years that aren't reflected in the Crate, but are now starting to be added to mobile device. And before we move on to the performance and the alternatives to ARM and ARM-based processors, briefly I'd like to mention some of the reasons why ARM had such a foothold. I did sort of lightly mention it earlier, but it was really key that when early on during the boom of mobile devices like smartphones, that ARM had already been a part of a lot of different embedded systems like Texas Instruments and in their calculators and in their devices, because when they moved to smartphones, they already had a basis for these lean RISC processors that fit those phones, because it was imperative back then that power efficiency was high, but performance didn't necessarily need to be. So their lean RISC processors were perfect for that. And that gave them a foothold over time to start adding more performance with newer designs and keeping performance or keeping power efficiency at the same level. So they've been keeping power efficiency about the same, maybe a few slight improvements here or there, but they've been able to just focus on adding extra performance through multi-core, through adding out-of-order execution, speculative execution, more functional units, and here when we talk about alternatives, that's going to be key to remember that they haven't had to deal with focusing on power consumption, because that was already settled for them. And now we get to if ARM processors are preferable to other options for mobile devices. Like I said just a second ago, there weren't many alternatives in the beginning. ARM had suit all their needs, and Intel and their x86 processors, they hadn't focused on scaling an x86 processor down to smartphone levels. They had them in laptops, and they weren't the most power efficient, but beyond that, they hadn't focused on moving them down to a level of power efficiency that could make it viable for a phone or some other handheld device. So ARM already had that covered, but around 2010, Intel scaled the Atom down a little bit to try and move it from a laptop processor to a phone processor, and or general mobile device processor, and they hadn't had much success trying to capture the market, because ARM already had a significant portion of it. But what we'll see here is that in a report by Van Smith from SPEC, the Intel Atom performs extremely well. In fact, it performs about 30% better overall in benchmarking against the A8 at the time. But it took 4 times more power during the heavy operation of the benchmarking tools, and about 2 times as much during regular operation. And so they, and in his report he covers this as well, that Intel has to play the catch-up game on power efficiency. And in general, that's true, because they can't focus on performance while they still can't compete in power efficiency. And the one thing the Intel Atom had going for it was hyperthreading, and you see that in all of the x86 processors in phones moving forward, because hyperthreading is actually a very power efficient way. It doesn't take that much power to include it to boost the performance of the processor. It would be a greater factor had mobile devices and mobile programs and the workloads that come with them had been multi-threaded, but they're still majority single-threaded, so it doesn't add up quite as much as Intel would probably. Before I conclude this presentation, I'd like to quickly cover a few new innovations in mobile processors and how that might change the way ARM processors and mobile devices look in the future. One of them is companion cores, which has been mentioned before in class as well as in a presentation. The companion core essentially takes some of the lightweight workload off of the main CPUs, and the companion core runs on lower power, so it's consuming less power to do these background tasks a little slower, which in the end doesn't hinder performance all that much, but it doesn't increase power efficiency, and you're starting to see that in newer smartphones, and you'll probably see that adopted in a lot of x86 based processors and the phones are found in. When it comes to where the architecture of the cores themselves look and the processors, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room in terms of where to go next, because multi-core is definitely an improvement, but it doesn't scale beyond quad-core, 8-core, and moving forward from that, you only get so many functional units before it starts to become a hindrance rather than a boon. So moving forward, you'll probably see when they do the move to 64 bits, which has started to happen within the past year or two, you'll probably start to see a fundamental shift in architecture and probably see a new ARM architecture starting to appear, and a couple companies might pick those up and start developing new CPUs for them. I know Qualcomm has done so with their newest Cryo series, the successor to Crate, and I believe Apple has started to do that as well. So in conclusion, ARM processors have been extremely successful in mobile platforms, mostly because of its RISC design and its history in smaller embedded systems. It gave it a good foothold early on, and they've been able to improve performance without having to worry too much about power efficiency because of its start having a very good power efficiency in the beginning. And as Intel continues to move rather slowly, but still continues to move the x86 processors into the mobile device territory, you'll probably see a greater focus on new 64-bit architectures that are starting to come out, and you'll probably also start to see more innovations like the companion core based architectures, in order to improve performance and improve power efficiency in the x86's case.